Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Lewis from thegingerpsychic.com together with Stephen Frampton from stephenframpton.com. We're here today to talk about Iraq, the center of astrology, the beginning of Western astrology, and also the center of the great Assyrian, Akkadian, Babylonian empires, Iraq. Stephen, how are you today, my friend?
I'm doing really well, thank you, Stephen, and I'm really looking forward to discussing Iraq. I'm very pleased that you mentioned the connection that we have as metaphysicians to that land, the birthplace of civilization. It's extremely sad to see that there's still absolute turmoil in Iraq.
Yeah. By the time Jesus Christ was born, there had been a continuous civilization in Iraq for 6,000 years. You see, the civilization in Iraq was already ancient at the time of Christ's birth, and for sure, the Iraqis were among the very first people to climb to the top of their ziggurats and to look at the wanderers in the sky and to correlate those cosmic wanderings with terrestrial events, earthbound events. And it's quite ironic that this center of intellectualism has evolved now to become a center of violence, criminality, and the denial of the rule of law. So we have a lot to talk about here. I believe we should probably, to understand what's happening in Iraq, we ought to examine the chart for 14 July 1958, which is when the Republic of Iraq was separated from the United Kingdom, when its borders were fixed by the United Nations, and this encompasses the period right on up until the overthrow of Saddam in the earlier part of this most recent century. So let's look at that July 14th, 1958 chart, shall we, Steve? Still with me, Steve? Or did I lose you?
Sorry, I put myself on mute in case there was background noise. But yeah, I was saying absolutely. That's the place to start. Looking at the character, the soul of the nation right now, based on that chart from 1958. And I know that you identified another chart for 2005 when the new constitution was put into place, so we can have a look at that one as well later on. But looking at this chart for July 14th, 58, there are things that stick out like a sore thumb. I know that you and I discussed some of them briefly before the show.
Right. Yeah, we might as well just go ahead and start talking about the sun in Cancer, which is very odd because America has its sun in Cancer.
Yes.
The difference is Iraq's sun in Cancer is in the 12th house.
Mm-hmm.
And this
in a powerful spot of the 12th as well because it's near the cusp.
Right. It's very close to the beginning of Leo, about 9 degrees or so, a little less than 9 degrees from the beginning of Leo, which puts it close-ish to the ascendant. But the 12th house really stands for a lot of bad things. One thing it stands for is confinement. Another thing it stands for is mistakes, and a third thing it stands for is the making of enemies, specifically private enemies.
Mm-hmm.
The sun in mundane astrology represents the leader, and it also represents the males of that country. And so here we have the sun in the 12th house of confinement, and we see where a lot of the males go. A lot of fighting age males, dissidents, were imprisoned in Ba'athist Iraq, in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The sun in Cancer in the 12th house represents a leader who is going to habitually and incessantly make mistakes.
Yeah, I think also the fact that sun is in Cancer is particularly interesting in this case because we know that the moon is the ruler of Cancer, and when you look at the aspect between planets in this chart for Iraq, the worst aspect is the moon in opposition to the major malefic Saturn.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a very intense opposition, and we know as astrologers that an opposition means two things pulling in different directions. They're tearing each other apart potentially, and there's this very tragic dynamic, and the common people, the moon, are just constantly torn by the cruelty and the disruptions of Iraq. And you mentioned these young men, Stephen. I almost cried, to be honest, on Sunday, or I think it was Saturday, when I read the news article with photographs, and there was actually a video clip that appeared, but of these young men who were in the army. But I don't think that being in the army in Iraq necessarily means it's like being in the army in the United States, where it's your profession and you're well trained and you've got the order, the hierarchy, the functioning hierarchy and support that's required. These look like young guys that are, maybe they've been offered a salary to be in the military, but they were wearing regular clothes.
Yeah.
And they were scooped up, hundreds of them scooped up by these insurgents, these militants, and led to their death, frog marched in a really awful manner to a ditch and told to lie in the ditch, and then executed. And it's hideous, and that is something that I think is described by the opposition, from the very strong opposition from the moon to Saturn in the Iraqi chart. And again, Stephen, when you think of the moon and we think of women, I think of the mothers and wives of Iraq and the daughters. How many women there must have lost their sons, their husbands, their fathers?
Yeah.
It's hideous.
It is terrible. And now, mentioning the moon, which in mundane astrology represents the people and their instincts, we see that there's a tight connection between the moon and the leader, because the leader is the sun, which is the leader, is in Cancer. You see, and the moon rules Cancer, and so, interestingly enough, I don't think that the moon is really benefited by this relationship. The activities of the moon are going to cause the leader to come into being. It's going to cause the leader to react, and the leader's reactions are going to cause that moon, which is in Gemini, a very polarized and bifurcated moon, a schizophrenic moon, a moon that's split probably between Shia and Sunni. There's a lot of splits in the moon. Now, the Saturn in Sagittarius, the major malefic Saturn in opposition to the moon, you're quite right. This is an afflicted, terrible moon. I have a lot to say about Saturn in Sagittarius, being in this chart in the 5th house. Mm-hmm. Saturn quite naturally represents denial, represents destruction and restriction. And being in the 5th house, this represents Saturn, the government, denying the people the voting franchise, which has historically been the case. Now, not to say that from all outward purposes, historically Iraq has probably put on a happy face for its people. The leadership of Iraq is probably, they would do just like, North Korea did, call themselves a republic and put on these airs of democracy. But the fact is not until only recently have the Iraqi people been allowed the voting franchise. So the Saturn in opposition to the moon represents a denial of the voting franchise. Now, Saturn in Sagittarius, retrograde, represents repeated air raid. Because the retrogradation is going to signify repetition. It's going to represent repeated bombing. Sagittarius represents airplanes, etc. And, if you look at the planetary periods of Time Lord rulerships, every single time Iraq engaged itself in wars, it was during a time when Saturn was the Time Lord. During the overthrow of the Ba'ath Party, Saturn was active. During the Iran-Iraq war, which was extremely bloody and extremely long and protracted, Saturn was a Time Lord. During the invasion of Kuwait, Saturn was a Time Lord. And also during the deposition of Saddam Hussein, Saturn was the Time Lord. So,
big Saturn theme, for sure.
Huge Saturn theme.
And, what a miserable place Stephen, to be a child? What a brutal, miserable place for children. And again, I think of the women of Iraq, many of whom will have young children that they love, and they want them to be safe and secure. What future is there right now for these children? You know, I mean, Saddam Hussein was slaughtering Kurds left, right, and centre. Didn't matter what age they were, and the country's still embroiled in conflict. So I think that Saturn in Sagittarius retrograde, because it's in the fifth house of children, amongst other things, it suggests that it's just a really, really terrible place to be a child in the world, and. Also, Sagittarius, we know, naturally rules the ninth, which is religion, philosophy, etc. And so much of the problem is due to different beliefs, the Shias and the Sunni groups. It's tribal conflict. And interestingly, when you were talking about the sun. We were talking about the moon and the sun, but the sun is not a great sun because it's squared by Mars, and I know we'll talk for sure about that Mars, Stephen, in fire in Aries, the later degrees of Aries as well, right next to the South Node. We'll have to have a conversation about that because that just stands out like a sore thumb in this chart. But the sun, the leadership, the essence of the nation, and men, generally speaking, they're squared by that Mars. They're squared by Jupiter. How unfortunate! And it's just a pretty miserable sun. The only it forms an inconjunct aspect. So an inconjunct aspect's roughly 150 degrees to Saturn, that really rough-looking Saturn. And again, Stephen, it makes you want to cry and say, for goodness sake, when we create a nation, when we create something, anything, get an astrologer. I mean, this chart just screams out problems. And I going back to the voting process and the new leadership, I think that Hillary Clinton made a very important point in her CNN town hall yesterday, because she made many important points, and I'm not being political, I'm just observing good common sense that I hear and like, regardless of where it comes from. But she made the point that the current Prime Minister of Iraq, is it Maliki, al-Maliki?
Right.
I think that's the correct pronunciation.
It's either Maliki or Talabani.
Talabani is the president, isn't he?
I think
and so. It's Maliki or Maliki. Yeah, I said in the pre-conference call Malarkey. No, it's Maliki. But she said he has not done enough. The leadership in Iraq has not done enough to integrate the Sunni minority. And it's a big minority because they're about 35% of the Muslim population, but they haven't been well integrated. So you had this brewing cauldron of potential tribal conflict. And I was talking to my uncle this morning. It's his birthday, and he's a really smart guy and very, very well informed. And he said to me, you know, Steve, you can't say it's like Northern Ireland, but there is a similar dynamic. And in Northern Ireland, the Protestants live in one area and the Catholics live in another area, and never the twain shall meet. And they're segregated. You can't just put them all in the same place. If you do, you end up with a bloodbath. And we've got this deep-rooted, historic, tribal conflict in Iraq, in the Middle East, that is so problematic and has to be so carefully managed. So I think Hillary Clinton is saying that Maliki should have made the integration or the appeasement of the different groups his highest priority, and she suggested that really hasn't been the case. You
know, interestingly, if we revert to the 2005 chart, You know, we can't really talk about the division of houses because we're not at all sure of the time of that chart. However, the sun's position in Libra will not change that much, will not change hardly at all based on the time. So we can talk a lot about that sun, and it's in Libra. Libra is the sign of the sun's fall, because the sun is exalted in Aries, and Libra is 180 degrees away from Aries. So the sun is not well placed in the mundane figure by being in Libra for a president, believe it or not. Now, on the surface, it might seem so, because Libra is a human sign. It's a sign of balance and justice. Now, however, the sun doesn't do well there. Reverting back to the 1958 chart that's responsible for Iraq from 1958 all through the Saddam era, we see the sun again in Cancer, and being in Cancer, that's also not a good placement for the sun, because Cancer is 12 signs away from the sign of the sun's rulership in Leo. So in other words, the way the ancient astrologers would say this is that, Cancer does not aspect Leo. It's in aversion to Leo. Even Libra aspects Leo. It's 180 degrees away, you see. So Cancer is like 12th house to Leo. You see what I mean? So having the president, having the symbol for the president in Cancer is a debility. Having the symbol for the president in Libra is also a debility. Now, talking about the children, probably the most heart-wrenching photos or stories to come out of Iraq are those photos that Saddam perpetrated at the height of his assholery. And that shows those poor little precious Kurdish babies after Saddam chemically bombed the Kurdish villages in the north. And, just seeing those children is enough to inspire rage and sadness toward that dictator. And interestingly enough, Mercury in the 1958 chart represents young people, and it's in Leo. For me, that's a very blatant and bald symbol for a combination of youth and war right there, and it's ruled by the sun. So we see that the leader, the sun in Cancer, is going to produce Mercury in Leo, and which are all of these abused and hurt children, and these children are also in turn going to cause the president to exist in the form of taking action against them. It's a sad thing.
It is very sad. I feel that I completely concur with what you've said about the sun in the 2005 charts when the new Iraqi constitution was put in place. I think the sun there is a better sun than in the previous chart. So obviously you remove a dictator like Saddam Hussein, and I firmly believe that we did the right thing. And I wasn't old when the first Gulf War occurred, but I was old enough to be reading and to be watching the news and thinking about what people were saying and what I was observing. And I've always felt that we did the right thing in the first Gulf War. I think that we mishandled completely the second Gulf War, but you look at the sun in this 2005 chart, and it's a better sun, I would say, than in the previous chart. So Iraq does now have a greater chance of putting in place good leadership. But the challenge is that although that sun is better positioned, I would say, than in the previous chart, it forms two aspects to Uranus. One is a sesqui square, which is not a positive aspect; it's an agitation, and it also is parallel, so at the same position in declination as Uranus. So it forms a strong connection to Uranus, which means that you're going to get very sudden or unexpected, strange shifts in leadership in Iraq. And again, it just makes you think: get an astrologer. Like you said, this is the birthplace of astrology.
Yeah.
Cradle of civilization. It's so sad.
And it's kind of ironic. I tell you what, we can definitely answer Mrs. Clinton's speculation, or we can answer your question as to why, the president of Iraq, the leadership of Iraq currently seems incapable of protecting its people. And in addition to the aspects, look at look at the ruler, the dispositor of the sun in Libra. It's Venus in Sagittarius. As far as I'm concerned, this is going to represent a number of things. It's going to represent money spent on defense and warlike sort of industries. Money spent on defense. It's going to represent money coming from foreign nations as well, such as America, such as Britain,
and Iran.
And Iran. Money coming from foreigners. Sagittarius it represents foreigners. Now, Saturn is also the exaltation ruler of that sun, and probably the almutin of the sun. In fact, Saturn is also co-ruler of the sun, and Saturn being in Leo also is going to be a problem in the sun's motivation. And the sun. Now, Venus is a symbol for Islam, and by ruling the sun, this means that we do not have, by any stretch of the imagination, a secular president at all. And we in fact never did. Secular rulership of Iraq has always been a problem. I would like to remind everyone that Saddam Hussein was supposedly a secular leader. I don't think anybody, by any stretch of the imagination, would ever consider Saddam Hussein a Muslim. Saddam Hussein was perhaps the wickedest figure in the 20th century.
Well, an important point, Stephen, and sorry to interrupt you, but you struck a chord that I feel very passionate about. We put Saddam Hussein in place.
Yeah, we did. We helped him.
We have meddled and meddled and meddled in the Middle East for a long, long time, and I know that we're saying right now we're not going to put boots on the ground in Iraq, and I feel that that's the right choice. But we still have to take action. We've got to do something. We can't sit by and allow this to happen. We shouldn't have sat by and allowed Syria to descend to the bowels of hell like we have. And looking at this chart again, the 2005 chart, the sun is conjunct the south node of the moon, and again, if you were talking with people who said, we're about to sign a new constitution, can you have a look at the astrology of it? First thing you'd say is, no, don't do it when the sun's conjunct the south node. You're going to have a complete energy vacuum. You shoot yourself in the foot before you've even started. So that's significant in the 2005 chart. Sun conjunct the south node. I know it's a broad conjunction, but it's a conjunction nonetheless.
Yep.
And the sun is closely involved with Jupiter, one's abundance and good fortune, and again religion and all philosophy. So that's associated with the sun that's conjunct the south node. Stupid. But going back to your point about Saddam Hussein, we put him there. We supported him, we financed him, because it suited us at the time, and then when it didn't suit us anymore, we removed him, and I actually believe that was the right thing to do, as I said. But we just drew lines, we just drew borders in the Middle East and expected everyone to just get on with it happily ever after. I think that what needs to happen in the Middle East is that the people of the Middle East need to be supported in deciding where they want their borders to be.
Yeah, in the 58 chart, the moon is in the sign of Gemini. Gemini represents sort of lines through the air, aka borders, but they're not fixed like they are in Aquarius. They're mutable. They're changing, and so the people are always going to be from the 58 chart. The people are always going to suffer from fluctuating borders, etc. But I want to look at that.
Even a fluctuating destiny as well, because you make a brilliant point there, but that moon is part of a grand trine that involves the North Node, Jupiter, and Chiron. So the North Node, the direction, the way they're headed, or where they're headed, is involved in that, with that mutable, flaky moon.
Well, I want to revert back to the 2005 chart that represents the current Iraqi leadership, and you pointed out the conjunction with the South Node. Let's look at this also. We have to the South Node, Sun, and Jupiter. This is a figure of what the ancients would have called assembly. See, it's like a stellium of these 3 points. Jupiter's good significations are thoroughly queered and debauched by its combustion with the moon. Jupiter's under the sunbeams here. It's combust, rather. And so it does not mean a good thing. But even more is that the sun is going to transfer the meaning of the south node to Jupiter, and it's going to weaken it even further.
Yeah.
You see. And also, Jupiter is occidental here, when he should be oriental, eastern of the sun. He's actually behind the sun. And so, Jupiter is not going to do good things for modern Iraq. He's an accidental malefic. Now, reverting back to the 58 chart for a second, and by the way, I want to point out that the sun in the 58 chart is approaching extremes of declination as well. So it obviously...
Oh, is it? I hadn't looked yet at the declinations.
Yeah, that sun is at something like 21 degrees. It has 21 degrees worth of latitude or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. It's just completely weak. But the people of Iraq that who we've been talking about, the people who've been suffering the most, I can't really vouch for where they're at in the 2005 chart. That would require a little bit more rectification. But Moon in Pisces seems about right to me. Sacrifice, martyrdom.
In the 2005 chart.
In the 2005 chart. But before we actually get into that, I just want to say, first of all, I respectfully disagree with you about the Persian Gulf Wars. I think the first one was a botched job, and the second one was a little bit more effective. Simply because the first go around, we should have deposed Saddam Hussein. We left.
Well, it was. Yeah, I agree with you. But the second one was effective, Stephen. It was effective in the sense that we did a lot of damage, etc. But
right.
it was. I don't think it was a responsible use of what politicians felt they were authorizing, and that's why there's so much criticism of Blair and Bush.
Right.
So I'm not with you on that one, but go ahead. I mean, I think it's great that we have different views at times, because if we didn't, it would be boring.
Yeah, it would. But also, I want to point out, though, I want to disagree also respectfully on one other point. I don't believe that we put Saddam in power so much. Saddam effected a coup d'etat with his Ba'ath Party. And for a while there, another individual ran Iraq after that coup d'etat. And during this period, up until 1979, Iraq prospered. Iraq's economy was very good.
But Stephen, we did support.
We did.
We did sponsor. This is my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that we supported the removal of the monarch, and because it didn't suit us. The monarch didn't suit us, so we supported the removal of the monarch, and I think that's what enabled Saddam to take power.
Right.
So I'm not saying that we built him a palace. And
my point, though, is that our support of Saddam Hussein really came into its own during the Iran-Iraq War, because at that time Iran really did us dirty. Iran, in 1979, Iran was a jewel in the Middle Eastern world. It was progressive under the Shah. It was a westernized country. Then in 1979, they had their People's Revolution. All of that changed, and we were not happy about that. So when Saddam, meanwhile, when he saw the revolution in Iran, he says, Iran is weak now. And he invaded, and one of the worst wars of the 20th century resulted from that. We supported Iraq very, very, very strongly in that war. We bolstered Saddam. We empowered Saddam. And we created a huge problem for ourselves.
Yeah, we did what suited us at the time. We generally do that. So
we did the same thing for Osama bin Laden too, by the way.
Yeah. I think that the point that I didn't make earlier, that I intended to make, was my feeling that, like it or not, we have meddled in this region of the world for so long that we do still have a responsibility to help sort it out somehow.
Yeah,
I don't think that necessarily means going in and with excessive force. I mean, a couple of million people, was it 2 million people? 2 million people died in the Second Gulf War, something like that. I mean, just crazy numbers, and it takes me back to our analysis, Stephen, of the greatest massacres in history, wars and genocide and natural disasters, and the data we were looking at. And when I remember that time when you and I were on the phone talking, and we said, "Oh my God, we haven't evolved, really, have we? We might have better technology, but look at the statistics for the 20th century. Look at how many people were killed in war. It's just awful.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, the only conclusion we can come to is that modern humanity covets and fetishizes warfare, at least modern America does. But, I mean, I don't think we have much of a choice, because we can't lose sight of the fact that there is a vital resource in the Middle East, and living without that resource is simply not an option, not unless you want to do without plastics, not unless you want to start riding bicycles.
You see, Stephen, when we're energy efficient, so we have this plan in the U.S. to become energy independent, self-sufficient. Right. I still think that we will have a responsibility to uphold and encourage good values, and to get involved in situations where something just dreadfully wrong is occurring. People are just being slaughtered. But you're right I think that's what the Gulf War was about. It was about oil, sadly, and we haven't done much in Syria, but oh gosh, we did remove Gaddafi in Libya, huge oil reserves, huge gas reserves. What a coincidence.
Yeah, we should have disciplined Syria with physical aggression the moment that they used chemical warfare against their own citizens.
Well, and I think that, my view is that John Kerry has something to answer for there, because despite criticism about Obama not taking enough action and potentially weakening the feeling in the world about the strength of the United States, it was John Kerry that made that statement that in public that Putin jumped on conveniently, which was about chemical weapons. And Putin jumped on the situation and said, "Oh yes, well we'll help them get rid of their chemical weapons, so you don't have to take action." And I think Putin's got a lot to answer for when it comes to death in Syria, the number of people that have died in the civil war there. And I think John Kerry I think that was a big blunder on John Kerry's part, because I think that put Obama in a difficult position in which it made it far more challenging to actually take action. But I'm with you completely in that we should have done something about Syria. It was obvious that the situation would deteriorate, and moderate opposition that was originally the people that were against Assad in Syria were moderate opponents to his dreadful brutality and regime. But if you allow a situation to just become completely chaotic, of course, insurgents and radical groups are going to take advantage. And ISIS in Iraq is from what I'm reading, is even worse than Al Qaeda.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. This ISIL group is terrible. Now, Mr. Kerry definitely did fall down, and we have to wonder if, in fact, he is the man for this job. I am not sure that he is. And our president has, in my opinion, been fairly effective in matters of diplomacy in the Middle East. And if his hands were not bound so strictly, I do feel as if President Obama would be able to affect some progress in the Middle East. Look at what he accomplished in terms of bringing Osama bin Laden to justice, and look at what he accomplished in terms of, I don't want to say ending the war in Iraq, and I'm not even sure if our exit strategy in Iraq was all that efficient. I'm not a politician. I don't know much about political science. I don't know. I would think that we would have learned from our debacle in Southeast Asia, where we didn't get beat by a bunch of people in wearing black pajamas. We signed a treaty and we left, but we were double crossed. The treaty was not honored, and I don't understand why we wouldn't have expected a similar situation, chaos to resume, etc. once we exited Iraq.
Yeah, and Stephen, going back to the 1958 chart in Iraq, you've got that sun near the cusp of the 12th house, so disappointments associated with leadership. And then you've got Uranus in what Casey said was the most powerful, what his guide said, what Spirit said through Casey and his channelings, that spot above the ascendant in a chart is the most powerful of all. And what have you got there? Uranus in a fire sign. So completely unpredictable. I don't think we did enough to think through what was likely to happen in Iraq. And Mrs. Clinton made another very good point, which was that Maliki, the Prime Minister, purged the army of some very good commanders that had been trained by us. So I think it takes us to this South Node, Mars conjunction in Aries of the 1958 chart, which is an ineffective military and an extremely unfortunate Mars aggression, violence in Iraq, because the removal of these good commanders must have weakened the military in Iraq, and they've lost a whole chunk of their territory to ISIS.
Yeah, I'm not convinced either that the current leadership of Iraq is beyond corruption, because being ruled by Venus in fire sign, Venus in Sagittarius is not necessarily very dignified, and I would not put some illicit behavior, some corruption, something like that. I wouldn't put it past it. At the very least, it's the Sun in Libra being ruled by Venus in Sagittarius. At the very least, it's going to represent clouded judgment on the part of the leadership, the Prime Minister, the President of Iraq, and certainly dismissing all of these experienced warriors from the Iraqi military was a huge mistake. I mean, if that's not clouded judgment, I definitely don't know what is.
Yeah, so the Iraqi leadership has a lot to answer for, because they wouldn't sign the treaty that would enable us to keep a military presence there, and they made bad choices about their own military. And I would love us to have a discussion, Stephen, about Mars, because
sure.
In the 2005 chart, Mars, the planet of war, planet of the military, arms, aggression, conflict, violence, is very closely conjunct the part of fortune. And I'd love to hear your observations about that Mars in the 1958 chart, particularly, because it's a miserable one.
Yeah. Now, on the surface of it, you think, wow, Mars in Aries, that's not so bad. Mars rules Aries, so, what could be so terrible about that? Unfortunately, as you pointed out, Mars is also conjunct the South Node. And so this is going to decrease the effectiveness of Mars. And indeed, in the 1958 chart, if you look at every single Iraqi conflict from there up until Saddam's deposition, Saddam's removal from power, Iraq never won a single conflict that it engaged in. It engaged in a lot. You see, it waged war on Iran. That was a fiasco. That was a terrible, terrible fiasco. So we can say very bluntly that in the 58 chart, Mars represents failed military gambits. Now, in the house system that I use, Mars is associated with the 9th house, which would also bring in the notion of a holy war, or a war based upon religious differences. And this calls up the notion again of the conflict between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Again, also Aries has to do with the expansion of things. Its association in the chart I use with the 9th house would also indicate, aggression against neighbors and foreigners, which certainly happens. It would also represent aggression from foreigners, which certainly happened as well. Now, even though Mars rules Aries, the Al-Mubtaz, the ruler of that particular point in Aries by exile is the Sun. See, even though Mars rules the sign at 25 degrees of Aries, the Sun gets more points. It's called the Al-Mubtaz. It's an Arabic word. The Latin astrologers sort of bastardized it to Al-Mutan, and it's called various things. Essentially, what it represents is sort of a weighted point scale where the Sun it gets more points, gets the most dignities at that particular degree of Aries. Therefore, this is a very blunt statement, a very blunt a tying in of the president in Cancer, sun in Cancer, to the military. It represents the military. In other words, the American military is not a personal plaything of President Obama. He has to jump through hoops in order to get the military to do things. He has to, you know what I'm saying? There's a Congress, there's a Senate.
Stephen,
not so in Iraq.
The timing is just of this is unbelievable, because just now a news report has been released saying that the Iraqis have formally called on the United States to launch airstrikes. Mars and Aries.
Yeah. Well, let's go to the October 2005 chart. That particular Mars is he's in detriment and retrograde. Mars in Taurus. Do you see? So this is going to represent a lot of disputes over Taurian things. Taurus represents capitalism. It represents also architecture, buildings and such. And, so Mars in Taurus is going to represent war, terrorism involved in buildings.
Yeah, and interestingly, there are big concerns about the sacred sites, the holy sites.
Yeah.
Because if the Sunni insurgents destroy holy Shia sites, then that just pours fuel on the fire.
It does.
I wonder if this opportunity to go after or have airstrikes and hit these insurgents hard will also be used as an opportunity to potentially hit them on the other side of the border in Syria.
I'm not sure, because you know what? The problem, the way that I see it, is that Venus in the 2005 chart not only rules the sun and screws up the sun, which is the leader, it also rules Mars in Taurus. Do you see what I mean? And so, to my thinking, this corrupted sort of Venus could very well likely represent spies, sabotage, insurgent operatives within the very bosom of the president and the cabinet of modern-day Iraq. It would not surprise me at all if, once the smoke clears on this thing, we discover that some of ISIL's primary leadership or some of ISIL's operatives they might actually be associated with the Iraqi military. They might actually be associated with the Iraqi government somehow. Because again, this is a civil type of dispute, and it's a religious dispute as well in the sense that it's between Sunni and Shia Muslims. But it's also a civil war too, because Iraq is divided along those religious categories. And so, for that reason alone, I would also expect there to be quite an amount of overlap, quite a sizable representation of the enemy within the very heart of the presidency and the government.
Yeah, also, Stephen, the one other huge problem here is we've been counterattacking terrorists, extremists around the world for quite some time now.
Right.
And what you've got here is a situation in which a dreadful bunch of them are creating their own little state. Or not so little state. What does that mean for the security of Israel? The Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Cameron, has already said that they know that there are attacks planned for London, and I read or heard yesterday that there's great concern about attacks on the U.S. homeland, because you allow this situation to these groups to proliferate, then they're going to get more organized and more capable. And I was looking actually several months ago at Egypt astrologically, and there were clear indicators in the major progressed aspects that Egypt's situation would deteriorate dramatically. And I think it was actually not in 2015, it was more in 2016 springtime, if my memory serves me correctly. I'd have to check my notes. But you think of this in the context of the Middle East more generally. What have you got? You've got Israel with a civil war to the north in Syria, all hell breaking loose in Iraq, potentially problems in Egypt. I wouldn't be surprised if Egypt descended into something akin to civil war in 2016. And Egypt's going to feel surrounded by chaos. And then you've got militant groups like these crazy insurgents in northern Iraq, the Sunni insurgents, that are going to be more capable of taking action.
Yeah, they are. I want to point out something that's quite interesting from the astrological factors in both of these charts. And to my thinking, the North Node in both the 1958 chart and the 2005 chart actually do indicate benefit. Some sort of, there has to be something good in both of these charts, and there is. But the North Node in the 1958 chart, it actually is going to represent benefit through foreign investment, benefit through things like that. In other words, a lot of the destruction that Iraq goes through, they actually sort of indirectly benefit through that in the terms of foreign investment, foreign intervention, foreign attempts to bolster their infrastructure. That was the 1958 chart. The North Node also always signifies increase in any chart that it falls in. And in this 2005 chart, it falls in Aries. So this is a very blatant statement that for Iraq, it's going to experience increase of things through the violence of Aries. Now, is this good or bad? I don't know. The increase could, the North Node in Aries could simply signify that there's going to be an increase of violence, or it could signify that Iraq's going to benefit from the violence somehow. That delineation of the North Node certainly remains to be seen, if you ask me. Certainly,
it's interesting to look at the aspects to the nodes in the 2005 chart. I'm just pulling that up in front of me. I've selected the wrong chart, the wrong screen. But I was going to have a look at the aspects to it. So to the North Node. Yeah, you're right. The North Node in the 2005 chart is quite well supported by harmonious aspects, isn't it?
Yes, they are, and I'm not sure that's a great thing either, because some of those harmonious aspects come from malefics. Saturn is going to sextile the South Node, and of course, by definition, trining the North Node.
And I think, Stephen, that's a good point to reiterate for listeners. Actually, for those people that are learning astrology, don't presume that a trine is always a good thing, because if it involves malefics. Right. I've just even seen, for example, in mass murderers' charts, a grand trine. You'd look at the chart, you take a glance at the chart and think, oh, there's a nice blue triangle. There's something good going on there. But if it involves a dreadful Saturn, then that's not the case. It changes the context. I think context is everything, so that's important. But I think in the 58 chart, isn't Saturn the most powerful planet, and it's dreadfully discordant?
Yeah,
I think it is.
Saturn.
Yeah, horrid Saturn, and it's the most powerful. So
Saturn has quite a bit of dignity in the 1958 chart. So it should be okay. It's the triplicity ruler. It has the dignity of triplicity in Sagittarius, and at 20 degrees of Sagittarius, it's in its decan. It's on its face. So it does have some dignity. But unfortunately, at the same time, it's afflicting other planets. It's afflicting the Moon and Venus through opposition, and it just signifies bad things by its house placement, by being in the fifth house. Saturn is tough. It's hard to deal with in any chart. It's always going to represent a denial, a rejection. It's always going to represent destruction. And in the sign of Sagittarius, it's going to represent, in a mundane figure like this, it's going to represent destruction through airplanes. And being retrograde is going to signify repeatedly destruction through airplanes. Either receiving it or administering it. No worries. It doesn't matter. It's ruled by Jupiter, which is in the third house in the 1958 chart. Jupiter is in Libra, conjunct the North Node. You'd think that would be a good thing, but because Jupiter is ruled by a corrupt Venus, what it represents, in fact, is a corrupted judiciary. In the 1958 chart, Jupiter represents the judiciary. that's completely cowed and under the thumb of Saddam Hussein. So, in other words, any support of bellicosity in Hussein-era Iraq through the judiciary is just a formality. You know what I mean? The judiciary was a personal plaything of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a process to
completely
enforce
corrupt
the will of Saddam Hussein. And
now,
again, in the 58 chart, that Jupiter is pretty strongly opposed by Mars.
Yeah, now get this. Here's where it gets really interesting. His third house is the house of publicity, and with that, with that badly disposed Jupiter there, as far as I'm concerned, it represents public humiliation of cabinet members and the judiciary. And what springs to mind is that infamous footage where Saddam Hussein takes the podium in his Congress or Parliament of Iraq right when he's about to assume power in the 70s, and he actually roll calls politicians and cabinet members and has them escorted out of the building, and they are subsequently executed. They're all.
Yeah, he used to drop people in vats of acid, to drop you alive in a vat of acid.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, I think the best piece of footage I've seen on Iraq was the execution of Saddam Hussein. And I'm not a bloodthirsty, vengeful person, but I watched that, and I felt no compassion for him whatsoever.
Nor did
I was very pleased to see the end of him.
He died a sloppy, humiliating death, and he got exactly what he did. His end, he cowered in a hole like a rat, and we dragged him out of that hole like the vermin that he was, and we put an end to him, and I'm glad. We also did the same to his two little dick-breath sons, those two little shit stains. I'm so glad that their lives were ended as well, because they were just as bad as the father, if not worse.
What happened to the rest of the family? Didn't the wife and did they go to Jordan? They disappeared with a bunch of money, didn't they?
They probably did. And they're probably, but they can't escape their karma. They're not going to be, there's no sin that goes unpunished. So, I'm not saying that they're guilty of anything other than being one of the wives of Saddam. If I'm not mistaken, Saddam actually had one of his wives killed. So, it's not a, being related to Saddam isn't necessarily
not necessarily a blessing.
No,
it's not a role I would choose in the world.
No. The biggest tragedy about Saddam Hussein is that his mother carried him to term.
Yeah, that's very true. It's very true. Listen, Stephen, I want to take a quick break if you don't mind. But then, can we talk about I'd like us to talk about the dynamics in the Iraq chart at this point in time. And I know that you've been doing your analysis of the Fedaria, etc. But I'd also like us to think about or discuss the major progressed aspects and even the transits of significant planets like Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, because I think that's really important for listeners. It's important that we all are clear about the fact that we can look at the natal astrology and it certainly tells us what's possible and what's highly probable in the entity that we're looking at, but we can also roll the picture forward to any point in time to consider what's likely to happen when. And we're right at this point. This situation's kicked off, a week and a half ago, and it would be really interesting to look at what triggered that, what's going on energetically within the chart, within the entity of Iraq, and how did all of this get triggered? How do we correlate what's occurring astrologically with what's actually occurring on the ground? Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. There's a veritable Niagara of astrological influences pouring into Iraq right now. And, it's going to be very interesting.
Veritable Niagara.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, well, on that subject, I'm going to take a quick break.
Sure
I'll be back.
Sure thing. And in the meantime, I'll definitely blab on as to what I think is going to be the future of Iraq. Now, interestingly, we don't really have to bring in a whole bunch of transits and progressions quite yet. The story as to what's going to happen with Iraq can totally be extracted just from the position of the planets. And because when a planet rules another planet, it represents both the source and the outcome of that planet. Therefore, let's look at Venus in Sagittarius. she's going to be ruling the president, the leader in Libra, and we're talking here about the 2005 chart in particular. And so Venus in Sagittarius, real quick, is going to represent a number of things. It's going to represent a love of bombs. It's going to represent, but let's just take that delineation match and just run with it. A love of bombs, a love of airplanes, etc. Now this is going to create, and remembering that a planet that rules another planet is going to cause that planet to exist. So this love of bombs, not saying the president loves it, but somebody loves it. This love of airplane and bombs is going to cause the president to take action, and consequently, any action engaged in by the president is going to cause Venus and Sagittarius to come into existence. Therefore, anything the president does, no matter what, the leadership of Iraq cannot win right now. Any move they make is going to cause two very malefic planets to come into existence. It's going to trigger Venus in Sagittarius. It's going to trigger Saturn in Leo. Saturn is in his detriment in Leo. Saturn in Leo represents anti-leadership sorts of qualities, and it's going to represent mistakes made by the president. According to the astrology that I'm seeing here, the president will not be able to avoid making mistakes. This is a president who needs training wheels. This is going to be a president who's going to require, this is not just the president, but the prime minister, the leadership of Iraq generically. They're going to require help. They're not going to be able to have the wherewithal to govern themselves effectively. Sun in Libra has its power diluted in a big way. It's opposite the sign of its exaltation, which means it's in fall. It's impeded. And so this is obviously not good. The conjunction is applying to a conjunction with Jupiter. This is going to harm Jupiter. Jupiter in Libra could be a very good thing. Now, another delineation for Venus in Sagittarius would represent the warlike expansion of foreigners, such as the United States. So the president's activities is pretty much guaranteeing that we're going to have to send our military back there again. In fact, this is already happening. We're sending several hundred Marines just to beef up the embassy there. And I'll tell you this: there's no Iraqi in existence who is going to want to tangle with the United States Marine Corps. They have certainly handled themselves with nobility and honor. So we've got those almost 300 United States Marines, good guys, going into Iraq. My prediction: I feel pretty strongly that there's going to be more military personnel flooding into Iraq. What do you think, Steve?
Well, as you said, they've already authorized 275 military personnel, I think it was, to bolster the embassy. Oh, yeah. And by the way, it's the biggest embassy in the world.
I can believe it. I'll tell you, I just want to say this real quick. Marines are the de facto security element in any American embassy. When I lived as an expatriate in various countries, I always loved going to the embassies because there were the Marines. I live in between two big Marine bases, Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point Air Station. And when I would go into those embassies to conduct my business, seeing those Marines there would always choke me up. They always brought me back home. You know what I mean? I love God bless the United States Marine Corps. I love them.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty certain that we're going to take action by air. As I said, the Iraqi Prime Minister has asked this morning for U.S. intervention,
he'll get it too.
Airstrikes. So I think that he'll get that. I don't think that they'll put boots on the ground. They've said that they won't. But I was looking, Stephen, at the progress chart and the eclipses. I'm looking at the 1958 chart. But we had a solar eclipse at 11 degrees Scorpio in 2013, November 2013. And the eclipses, as we know, indicate themes that are building. It's giving you more of the context, more of the picture. It shows you what's hot, what's coming up, what's going to get triggered. Well, that eclipse at 11 degrees Scorpio was forming a perfect square or obstacle aspect to that unpredictable Uranus in the very powerful position of the 1958 chart. So, again, if we'd looked at it, we'd have said, hold on, there's something unpredictable is going to come up with Iraq, for sure. That eclipse indicated this was the case. And what rules insurgents? Uranus.
Yeah, the suddenness and the natural defiance and rebellion is definitely a delineation match for Uranus. And I think the symbolism there is quite stark in that regard. And, you know, we left Iraq kind of sloppily. You know, the American public was quite tired of Iraq by that time, just as we're tiring of Afghanistan. But
Stephen,
yes.
even clearer, unbelievable. And I just wish that as part of the procedures to assess threats in the world, metaphysical insight was used. The April 15th lunar eclipse conjunct the south node in the Iraqi chart, conjunct the progressed south node.
Yeah, that's...
So that combined with the Scorpio eclipse in November said, big problem coming in Iraq.
Oh, yeah. I mean, ISIL is not going to just go away. If we should know anything about Muslim insurgency, is that it's extraordinarily tenacious, crafty, ingenious, and it's saturated with double agents. You know, they run a very good counterintelligence game. You know, the Arabic and the Muslim insurgency is quite effective. It's a formidable opponent for the United States of America, and if we're hoping to have some sort of definitive victory over them, then we're not really taking into account our history very well.
You know, the cardinal cross as well. The transiting cardinal cross between Pluto squaring Uranus, Pluto in opposition to Jupiter, and Jupiter therefore squaring Uranus. The cross completed by Mars in opposition to Uranus, squaring Jupiter and Pluto. That powerful cross at the time of the April 29th eclipse this year.
Yeah.
Part of fortune. It's all wrapped up in the part of fortune, the natal part of fortune in Cancer in the 1958 Iraqi chart. These charts were screaming out that a problem was on the horizon, and that eclipse at 8 degrees Taurus is right at the midheaven of the 1958 Iraqi chart.
I want to point out that the part of fortune represents one main thing, and that is monetary gain. And I'm convinced that the configurations of both the 2005 chart and the 1958 chart are such that Iraq was designed to benefit from warfare, from foreign intervention, and in fact they will. There's going to be a lot of monetary gain from that. I mean, what springs to mind right now is a child that whines and pouts in order to get a gift or something, some support from mommy and daddy. Mommy and daddy being, in this case, the coalition powers of Britain, America, well, I shouldn't say Britain, but the United Kingdom, America, Canada, et al. And Iraq arguably has benefited monetarily through American intervention in terms of increased infrastructure, in terms of increased security compared to now. And so my theory, I suggest to everyone that developments in Iraq are going to benefit Iraq financially in the long run. And even though the current leadership of Iraq would probably hotly dispute my claim, I'm convinced that they're aware of this at some level and that they intend to exploit it.
Yeah, well, war's a dirty business for many parties, and industries, the defense industry and the reconstruction industry make serious money out of warfare.
Yeah, not just for us, but also I want to point out that the part of fortune in the 58 chart is conjunct the sun. It's in the sign of Cancer where the sun is. So in 58 chart, these activities, bellicose, warlike activities, they benefited the president financially, and in fact they did. Saddam Hussein lined his pockets with plunder, and it's going to be a similar situation in modern Iraq as well. I don't know what house the 2005 chart's part of fortune is at. I do know the sign. It's in Gemini. So this is going to represent monetary gain through border problems. It's going to represent monetary gain through increased business. It's going to represent because Gemini represents business. It's going to represent monetary gain through the media. is going to represent monetary gain through a bifurcation of the populace. Gemini is naturally split. So, the part of fortune is hardwired in both charts to profit off of some pretty gnarly things.
It's a sad picture. What about the Fideria? What's the Fideria saying right now, and what's it indicating for the foreseeable future?
Well, for the Fideria, we would have to. Fideria is an important part of. It's an important rectification tool. This chart is not at all rectified. So, in other words, we don't know if the 2005 modern Constitution of Iraq was ratified during the night or during the day. This would be what's pertaining to the. This is what would be what's important as far as the Fideria is concerned. Now, let's do some speculation here. Looking at the Fideria, if we assume, which is pretty much standard, a daytime, like 12 o'clock sort of birth for this state, for this entity, then we're going to start out with the Fideria of the Sun, which we're still in. And quite interestingly, the Fideria support the idea that this is a diurnal day birth for this figure, because things in Iraq have been relatively placid up until recently. And May 12th, 2014, we entered into the Mars rulership period of the Sun's Firdar, which is quite it's a delineation match. So what we're looking at now from essentially the autumn of next year until August 24th or actually until the autumn of 2023. So we're talking about a period from 2015 to 2023 is going to be ruled by Venus. We've already talked about Venus's placement in this 2005 chart. Venus is thoroughly debauched here. Venus is not good in the 2005 chart. Venus, first of all, is in trine with Saturn. Venus is opposed to the part of fortune, and Venus is in Sagittarius. Looking at what dignity Venus may have, not so bad. Venus can be rehabilitated, perhaps. However, Venus is going to represent foreign involvement, and so looking at the period of the Firdar period from 2015 to 2023, the only conclusion we can come to is that there's going to be foreign involvement in Iraq for that entire period. So we're looking at the next 10 years at least, probably, that we're going to be involved with them.
Yeah, they've got a challenging major progressed aspect between Mars and Uranus, which is early July 2015. It'll be interesting to see what that brings. And looking out towards the end of the decade, we've got a square between the Sun and the Moon that peaks in 2018, September time. Then 2019, you've got a square between Saturn and the Sun. And then 2020, Saturn square Sun, Saturn square Venus. So it looks to me like they will be particularly problematic times.
Yes, they will. Saturn in Taurus is going to represent a lot of bad things. One bad thing it's going to represent is illegal capitalism, capitalistic crimes, corruption, in other words. And it's retrograde, so it's going to represent an incessant repetition of financial crimes coming out of Iraq. This is very important for we Americans to know, because our tax dollars are going to be flooding into Iraq, and I want everybody out there to know that when that happens, our tax dollars are going to be completely mismanaged by Iraq. They're going to be funneled into criminality, and it's going to be a complete waste of our tax dollars. That's important. So any transits, any progressions of Mars, any dynamic activity of Mars is going to represent financial improprieties, illicit financial behaviors on the part of the Iraqis. Furthermore, it's going to represent also, because Mars represents disputes and contentions, it's going to represent financial disputes and contentions by its placement in Mars repeatedly. And Mars represents violence, terrorist attacks versus infrastructure and buildings. So any dynamic activity, transits, solar returns, progressions, etc., also going to any contacts, especially with Uranus, that's going to represent bombings, it's going to represent criminality, etc.
Well, Stephen, the couple of things that are particularly alarming in the 1958 chart, and I'll look back at the 2005 chart in a minute.
Sure.
The first thing is that transiting Uranus is currently at 16 degrees Aries.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got that unpredictable, revolting, literally, Uranus in a fiery cardinal sign, Aries, and it moves very slowly, but it is moving gradually up to the natal Mars at 25 degrees Aries and the progressed south node in the Iraqi chart at 24 degrees Aries. So that's concerning, because when Uranus strikes the south node, you're definitely going to have trouble, and because it's occurring in Aries, it's going to be damn fiery, and it's going to be unexpected because it involves Uranus. And the other thing is that very powerful, extremely powerful eclipse at 0 degrees Aries, 0 degrees Cancer, which I think it was, did we say it was 2019 or early 2020s?
Yes,
2020?
we did.
Somewhere around there. That's actually going to square the progressed Jupiter and the North Node. It's going to be in the bends, in effect, of the nodal axis in the 1958 Iraqi chart. So anything that squares the nodes is problematic. So that eclipse will... Oh, actually, will it square the nodes? Hold on, I might be wrong there. 1, 2, 3. Yes, it does. Not good. That's not good at all for Iraq. But that eclipse is going to be very, very significant for many, many nations and many, many people.
Well, you know what? I have to. The way that I interpret, or the traditional method of interpreting the nodes. One thing, it's going to be public. The nodal axis it connects any chart to the public. The nodal axis is an axis of relationship, and second of all, the south node in particular sort of sucks out the vitality of whatever's conjuncting it. That's one reason why the 1958 chart's Mars is so inept. That's why the Iraqi military could not win. It couldn't fight. It couldn't win a conflict. It's because it's conjunct the south node. Its potency is decreased. So if Uranus conjuncts that south node, I would expect a decrease in Uranus's maleficence, believe it or not, and effectiveness. So in that case, it might represent sort of a close call. Now, looking at the 1958 Jupiter conjunct the north node, we talked about Jupiter being an accidental malefic. In other words, Jupiter being sort of accidentally a bad guy in this chart, and it's conjunct the north node. Now, if the south node decreases things, the north node increases things. And so to have a malefic, even an accidental one like Jupiter, to be conjunct the north node, this is very bad. It's going to increase its evil. We already said that Jupiter in the 58 chart represents a corrupt and sort of cowed and dominated judiciary. And Jupiter in the 58 chart rules the 8th house of death. So, you know, in the 58 chart, that represented a lot of bloodletting and death that resulted from a corrupt judiciary. In the 2005 chart, the north node it's in Aries. It's going to represent an increase either in or through bloodshed and war. And the south node being conjunct the sun decreases the sun's potency, decreases the effectiveness of the leadership, and all of that good stuff. So, you know, either way you cut it, the nodes don't represent good things in either chart. Can the nodes ever represent something good in a person or a country's chart? Absolutely they can. There are certain nodal placements that are beneficent, that are benevolent and helpful. Iraq has neither one.
The nodal axis is interesting culturally as well, Stephen, because, you know, in the West we always feel that the north node of the moon, where energy is incoming, we feel that is the benefic side of the nodal polarity, because we generally think that getting stuff is a good thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, getting more money, getting more property, getting more goods. This is all good. This is what we're about in the West. So we see the North Node and an influx of energy as a good thing. But then you have to sit back and say, well, yeah, but a slap in the head with a hammer that's incoming energy too. But that's not a good thing.
Right.
And having someone run into the side of your new car is incoming energy, but it's not a good thing. So you have to look at it from that perspective. But the Eastern tradition is more considers the exit of energy in the south node, the karma of the south node, to be more benefic than the north node. So having energy coming in is not necessarily a good thing. It's potentially more of a burden. And they see, for example, that potentially the release from physical life, which is very much activated in this. You see the south node activated when someone passes to spirit, because it's a release of energy.
Oh yeah.
The release of the spirit. And the Easterners, many in the Eastern tradition, will say, well, that's a good thing. And it's interesting from the perspective of life and death, because we're also in the West, we're so consumed by doing as much as we can between birth and death, run.
Yeah.
But actually, when you take a more philosophical perspective and consider that this is a step in a long journey, then the release of the physical body is not necessarily a bad thing, and therefore releasing, and that south node of the moon has its very benefic application. But then, in summary, all of that said, generally when you're working with clients, as we do, and you see the south node being triggered, then they're going to be letting go of something, and the ultimate is letting go of life on the physical plane.
Oh yeah, as always, I think probably one of the keys to interpreting the nodal axis is its placement and its context. For instance, in my chart personally, I'm quite fortunate that I have the south node in the 12th house. This weakens my private enemies. It lessens the severity of my mistakes, etc. The north node in the 6th house actually improves my health, offers a modicum of protection to the health, etc. So, I mean, for me, the way that I interpret the nodes, drawing from the medieval tradition, which I want to point out quite clearly that the medieval European astrological tradition emanated from Iraq, came out of Baghdad. One of the biggest traditional authors that I find in my textbooks frequently is Abu Mashar. He was the astrologer of Baghdad, But anyway, I digress. The interesting thing about the nodal axis in medieval Western astrology is that both nodes are considered to be malefic, north and south, which is quite a provocative proposition. It's a delineation, it's an interpretation that has been lost or largely ignored by modern astrology, and yet it's a delineation that sometimes bears fruit. I mean, in all cases, I really do think it matters a great deal how the nodes are configured in a specific chart.
Yeah, I saw a client the other day who had the nodal axis, or the nodal axis had progressed to 0 degrees Cancer and 0 degrees Capricorn, and she was wondering why her life was just completely changing all of a sudden. And I was explaining, well, your nodal axis has backed up to 0 degrees, that's the most cardinal points of cardinal signs. So yeah, you're going to see this. Your world's going to spin around. Very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and they move very, very slow. I want to point out that
28 years to cycle the zodiac, roughly?
Roughly, yeah. I want to point out that the nodes, north and south, are not physical points. They're places where the moon crosses the plane of the intersection of the ecliptic and the equator, I want to say. Every planet has nodes, but it's the nodes of the moon that interest us the most. And they're mathematical abstractions. They're not actual physical bodies that are orbiting in space. And they are frequently retrograde as well. Frequently retrograde. It's interesting that the nodes are connected to the moon. The nodes that we interpret most commonly are the lunar nodes, and the moon is the fastest body in the chart, and yet its nodes are among the slowest points that circumvent the zodiac. They're fascinating.
They are. I mean, astrology is just fascinating. Period.
It is. It's as far as I'm concerned, as an investigation tool, an astrological chart is way superior to a polygraph in terms of determining the truthfulness of someone's statement. If I were a detective,
oh yeah,
and in a sense, we certainly are detectives, aren't we, Steve? In my detective work, I certainly trust horary astrological charts way more than I trust polygraphs. Criminals can circumvent polygraphs. One can never the way the polygraph is tied to a person's peculiar biology, heart rate, etc., blood pressure, etc. These things can be circumvented by the cunning, but there's no way they can circumvent astrology. And the picture portrayed by astrology is always sharp. The only way it fails is through interpretation of the human. But the astrology is usually pretty. I mean, is it perfect? I'm not prepared to say that it's absolutely perfect. But because human interpreters are not perfect, but certainly more perfect than a polygraph.
Well, it blows my mind every time this is how we make our living, so we're doing it all the time. But when you start out, you realize how much there is to learn, and then when you're really proficient, you have these moments where you're looking at a case and you see the astrology of it, and it just blows your mind how accurate it is, how the situation was just so clearly described astrologically. And you have a number of times when you just feel blown away by it, and then you get to the stage where you still feel excited, but you don't even raise an eyebrow because you just get so used to the fact that situations are so clearly described astrologically. It's just so accurate. It's unbelievable. Yeah. There really is an amazing mind and amazing intelligence at work in the universe and beyond, because these metaphysical tools are so accurate when correctly used. And I think you're right that the limitation is to do with our understanding and human error.
Sure.
But I'm excited about our consulting venture, our decision to create a consulting arm of our businesses that will be focused upon insight for corporations and politicians, crime, law enforcement, etc. I think that we've done quite a bit of that, but actually formalizing it is really exciting.
Absolutely. I'm keen to tackle the financial markets globally. I'm keen to tackle investment consultations. I'm definitely keen to tackle political elections and political questions as well. And I want to emphasize that astrology, perhaps one of the most offensive applications of astrology to the religionists, is its ability to elect inceptions of things. This seems to me to contravene most of the scriptural prohibitions against astrology. Astrology, this might surprise people, astrology is quite easily tolerated in Scripture, but there's only one branch of it that seems to get the cleric's attention riled up, and that's astrology's ability to say the right word, the right time to begin something. Do you see? Astrology is perfect for that. So a good astrologer can tell you when to sell your house, when to start your business, when to announce your candidacy for Congress, when to invest in such and such a stock, etc.
A great example is Reagan. Reagan's inauguration was planned to the minute astrologically. They chose a brilliant time. Couldn't go wrong with that inauguration.
Reagan got 2 terms.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy Reagan, she had her astrologer, who, by the way, would not release the president's birth time. I don't know why, but we've rectified the president's chart. But you would be absolutely amazed at the pervasiveness of astrology, astrological reliance, and astrological counseling that happens in Capitol Hill and on Wall Street as well. So I'm very keen to get started on these things. And of course, another area that we're definitely interested in, anybody who listens to the show understands that we are interested in criminality and criminology, I should say. We're law-abiding citizens. But we're definitely interested in investigations. We're definitely interested in helping law enforcement. And there is no tool that can surpass forensic astrology. That can surpass astrology when it comes to answering questions and investigating particularly thorny issues. Now, will it ever be accepted as evidence in court? I can categorically say that it probably will not. However, neither is a polygraph. So go figure. Polygraphs are inadmissible as evidence in court, yet they're an important investigative tool. So as far as I'm concerned...
You're right. This is what I say. The proof is in the pudding,
yep.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be used in court. But, for example, if law enforcement have 10 suspects, 10 murder suspects, and they have limited resources, limited time to actually investigate and get to the bottom of the problem or the case.
Right.
Well, if you can say this is your man or this is your woman, and unfortunately murderers are generally male rather than female.
Right.
But if you're able to say, well, this is your man, astrologically I say to you, this is your man, well, at least enables them to focus their resources. This is what I find, that they can then focus their resources on really getting concrete evidence associated with that person rather than having a scattered approach with too many suspects and not necessarily getting anywhere.
Absolutely. It often happens in cold cases especially that the police have actually already interviewed the perpetrator, and they just didn't realize it. You know what I'm saying? A lot of cold cases, there's going to be a huge pool of suspects, and it constantly happens that when these cold cases are finally cleared, the cops are slapping their heads. They're like, we talked to this dude already. You see? So as a focusing tool, astrology is non-pareil. It's without peer. It's absolutely without equal. And very valuable. Another area where astrology is useful is in the domain of doing research into competitors for businesses. You know, if you run a corporation and you want to understand what your competitors are up to, if you run a business and you want to understand what your opponents are doing, then an astrologer would certainly be a very good counselor for you to have on your side. So it's wonderful work, and of course, its applications for mundane matters, for matters of current events and world importance, cannot be underestimated as well. We already know, judging from the astrological charts of Iraq, that foreigners such as Britain, such as America, we're going to be involved with Iraq for a very long time. I'm anticipating a huge expenditure of money in the direction of Iraq, and furthermore, I expect that money to be misappropriated, mishandled by the leadership of Iraq as well. Knowing these issues in advance, maybe we can do something to circumvent it. There's going to be, not only is there going to be a need for increased military presence in Iraq that's going to be fulfilled, but there's also going to be a need for an increased fiscal observance to make sure that not only Iraqi leadership handles the incoming funds well, but also to make sure that American military contractors and Americans who involve themselves in war profiteering in Iraq, to make sure that they don't engage in any hanky-panky. Who knows? I'm not sure if the accounts of Blackwater and other military contractors, I don't know if those accounts are available for public scrutiny, but they should be. I'm sure.
Well, the other thing that I don't know whether this is available for public scrutiny, but it should be if it's not, and that is ownership, investment in the defense industry.
Absolutely.
I read that Susan Rice has significant investments in this oil dredging exploration.
Yeah.
I found that to be strange. Potential, well, not potential, but
hinky.
Well, conflict of interest.
Yeah, so
it's like me. You know, if I invested in your business, and then I'm portraying myself as some uninvolved bystander that can make rational observations that aren't affected by my investment. So I don't get it.
Yeah,
I don't understand how it's allowed, to be quite honest.
To my understanding,
if I'm involved in governing your business or your industry, I shouldn't be embroiled in or have my investments embroiled in your industry or your business.
Right, because the Security Exchange Commission makes that. I mean, it's illegal. I mean, there's a breadth of insider trading there, isn't there?
Yeah, it's just odd.
Yes, we definitely have to watch where the money goes. But you know what? We've come down to the final 15 minutes of our show here. What I'd like to do is just remind everyone that you can find psychic medium and astrologer Stephen Frampton at StephenFrampton.com. You can pick up a copy of his book, Thinking Completely Outside the Box, which is a fairly brilliant academic expose of the astrological conditions behind the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting perpetrated by James Egan Holmes. It's a slender volume, absolutely packed with valuable information. The first portions of it lay out a very effective primer and sort of an educational module on astrology. If you're having trouble keeping up with some of the astrological theories in our talks on metaphysical media, then you can certainly bring yourself up to speed on the basics of astrology by picking up that book. It's got a lot of really cool articles there. And, of course, by all means, schedule a consultation with Stephen Frampton. He is a psychic medium, so he just doesn't restrict himself to astrology. He can help you connect with loved ones who've passed into spirit as well. It's no secret. I love the guy. He's my business partner. I respect his abilities. And, in fact, he's done work for me as well. I consult him when I need things, and he's a great guy. Go visit him at StephenFrampton.com. And, hey, you know what? I'm not exactly chopped liver over here either. Find me at thegingerpsychic.com. Book a consultation with me. I'm an analytic astrologer. Astrology is my specialty. I also am a tarot reader. I got a ton of really entertaining and informative articles over there as well. It's a great little slice of the web. Go over there, make yourself at home. And, of course, if you have any thorny problems in life, if you're curious about where you came from karmically, your past life, your future life, if you're just mystified by life and want to know what the hell is going on, book a consultation with me. We'll get you started on the right path, no problem. But you know what? We should talk a little bit about what we're going to handle next week, Steve. What's on your mind for next week?
I don't know, Stephen. I just was thinking a moment ago that you're likely to ask me this question, and I'm not sure. I mean, we've got so many subjects that we'd like to explore. So we said that we really want to explore at some point Israel and Palestine. We wanted to look at Syria. There's just the stock exchange. There's so much to look at. I wonder whether Well, I think firstly we need to keep our eye on what happens with Iraq and the Middle East in the next few days. So I think we should reserve the right to change the show based upon what's actually going on in the world. I mean, we're metaphysical media, so we want to stay focused on the things people are interested in. But if there's no significant change in circumstances, I was wondering whether we start looking at the stock exchange.
Well, I'll tell you what.
My challenge, though, is that I'm traveling for the next 5 days, and I won't have time to do a lot of analysis historically on the astrology of the stock exchange. You know,
let's keep it in the Middle East. This is what's happening. This is what's hot right now. Let's keep it in the Middle East. Let's either do Israel or Iran. Or Syria. Maybe we can do Iran, seeing that Iran is sort of like a natural enemy of Iraq. Or we could do Israel.
Well, no, natural friend all of a sudden.
Yeah, because Iran is largely Shiite, and I was surprised to discover. You told me, in fact, that Iraq is majority Shiite. I actually assumed that because Iraq waged war on Iran, that Iraq would be majority Sunni, but it's not. I should have known better because Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a completely secular affair. Saddam Hussein, even though he went through the outrageous and flamboyant measure of having the Quran inked in his blood, Saddam was about as religious as my left testicle, which is to say he was not religious at all. Saddam Hussein, if you are religious, you have to believe that Saddam Hussein is burning in hell right now. He's not religious. And despite his efforts to have the Quran written in his blood, Saddam Hussein is roasting in the pits of hell. He's not religious at all. His Iraq was a completely secular affair. So I shouldn't be surprised that there's a Shiite majority in Iran. The ISIL component, I want to say that they are Sunni, though, if I'm not mistaken.
Say that last part again, Stephen. I didn't catch that last thing you said.
The ISIL.
Sunni.
Yeah, I want to say they're Sunnis. The current insurgents. I want to say that they're Sunnis.
Yes.
But at any rate, we'll keep it in the Middle East next week. And you know what? Why don't you guys, listeners, contact us by all means. You can reach me at Stephen@thegingerpsychic.com. You can reach Stephen Frampton at inquiries@StephenFrampton.com. Give us your opinions. What would you like to hear about as well? We can definitely touch upon a lot of topics. And by all means, we've been getting a lot of birth dates. A lot of people wanting us to delineate their natal charts on the air, and we're still going to do that at some future date. So don't be shy about sending us that information. We will definitely get to you at some point. Next week, I'm thinking we're going to do either Iran or Israel. We're going to keep it in the Middle East. That's going to have America busy probably for the foreseeable future. The Middle East is also a sort of a middle ground between diplomacy for Iraq, for the United States and Russia as well. So it's worth keeping our eye on,
Yeah, I would like to look at Iran. I find Iran interesting, really interesting country. And also, I'd like to better understand Iran. And as you said, because everything seems to be kicking off so much in the Middle East, it would be good to look at Iran, and maybe even to consider this current synastry between Iran, the US, and Iraq. And I'd love for us to look at Israel and Palestine in future as well. I'm very interested by Israel, and I've been watching quite a lot of documentaries and doing a lot of reading about Israel. There's one documentary out there, Stephen, on Israel that's particularly interesting. It's about the real extremists in Israel, because you've got there these incredibly hardcore right-wing nationalists that truly believe that the Jews are better than everybody else. And this is a minority. This is a small group of people that actually are engaged in terrorist activity against the Palestinians.
Oh, man.
But very, very interesting, because what they've been doing is they've been creating their own little settlements. So we know that the Israeli state has settlements, official settlements. They're not. They're official in the sense that they're clear about the fact that they're there, that they put them there, and that they want to keep them there. But that they're not official in the sense that they're sanctioned by international law. But there are these other people, these real hardcore nationalists that have created their own little outposts. I'm going to go and live on that hill over there and create my own little settlement, and if you come near it, I'm going to kill you, that kind of thing. And these people are involved in terrorist activities against the Palestinians, but also they have plotted and stated intentions at times to destroy the two sacred mosques in Israel, in Jerusalem. And the security services in this documentary were saying, they're the biggest threat to Israel, because if they did that, if they destroyed those mosques, you watch Israel get destroyed by the Muslims. So Israel's a really interesting one to look at as well at some point, high on my list.
Yes, high on my list as well. I'll go ahead and go on record as saying right now that I am not very empathetic to Israel. My heart is very much with the Palestinians in this conflict. I would also make the argument that the Israeli extremists are far from a minority. Israeli terrorists might be a minority, but Israeli extremists are definitely not. I've spent a lot of time among Orthodox Judaism, and I can really vouch for the notion that their opinion of the Palestinians is not at all conducive to a healthy diplomacy. And, in fact, Israeli nationalism is part of a huge problem with Israeli terrorist attacks. So, when the Zionists went into Israel, they started using a lot of the tactics that they learned in Nazi Germany. And so, no, I definitely believe Israel has a right to exist. I'm not going to go overboard here. Mm-hmm. However,
they have a right to defend themselves, but I'm not sure that includes the right to completely suppress the Palestinian people.
Yeah, I think that their treatment of the Palestinians is unabashedly racist. I think there's a lot about modern Israel that is completely contradictory to American ideas of equality. And quite frankly, it's my personal opinion that America has overextended itself diplomatically with Israel. I'm not very happy with Israel's influence over American politics, and I don't think Israel really represents much of a diplomatic boon to America. I don't understand what exports they have that are beneficial to us, except maybe for figs or olives.
Well, there's more to it, isn't there? Because it's the wealth of Israel and involvements and investments in the United States, and I certainly need to do a lot more research. I worry about the Palestinian people in that I worry about the conditions they live in, etc. And I like the fact that Obama took a less pro-Israeli line. I think he's had to manage that very, very carefully, and I think he's handled it pretty well. But I guess I'm probably I'd probably take more of a middle road line on the Israeli-Palestine situation than perhaps you would. But I'm really excited to do more research on that.
Yes, so am I. The Israeli economy is actually quite shitty. I mean, Israel is practically a communist country, and communist economies, socialistic economies, they don't fare very well. And in fact, Israel, their economy has a lot of problems. Let's just put it that way. And what bothers me about Israel is that they routinely flout United Nations directives. They routinely violate human rights. If America behaved as Israel did, for example, toward its minorities, then the Congress would be inundated with civil rights issues hitting its doors. I don't understand how on earth we can tolerate some of what can only be called Israeli human rights violations against the Palestinians. I just don't understand that. I'm completely flummoxed.
Well, the settlements. The settlement situation surprises me because they're illegal.
Well, not only the settlement situation, but hey, guess what? What if I'm a Palestinian and I fall in love with an Israeli? I cannot, by law, marry her. There's no interfaith marriages that are allowed, or at least let me put it this way: they're severely frowned upon. If a Christian were to marry an Israeli, the families they've been known to mourn their deaths. But at any rate, that's for next week. That's for next week or the week after or what have you. I certainly, think that Israel should retain its position in the Middle East. I wouldn't advocate, where else are they going to live at? I think they have a right to exist. I'm not going to take the, Iranian hard line. However, I would like to see them be a lot more humanitarian in their behavior toward the Palestinians. And it's just a thorny issue. But can you imagine? Here you're living in your home, and all of a sudden these thugs come in. They disenfranchise you. They move you out of your home. They put you in these refugee camps. They restrict your move. I would not like that. Hell no, I wouldn't like that. They'd have a problem with me if they did that to me and my family. No. Israel invites a lot of problems onto itself, and I don't want them to drag America into it. Israel wants to make problems with the Arab world. Let them. That's Israel's business. It's not mine. But at any rate, that's for next week. We've got a few minutes here. I suppose we should go into our exit here. Steve, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for helping to make this show possible.
Thank you. Same to you.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of our millions of listeners out there, billions of listeners. President Obama, I know you're listening. I wanted to give you a big thumbs up.
And Hillary Clinton. Good.
Mrs. Clinton,
we loved I loved the town hall discussions. Thanks for listening to our radio show today.
Absolutely.
Feel free to quote us.
We'll see all of you guys next week. Please be good to one another, and don't forget to join us next week for another exciting edition of Metaphysical Media. And on that note, I will say goodbye and adieu.